She begged to be let in, voice raw from wind and hunger. He had shut his door to the world long ago, yet something in her trembling words struck deeper than the storm. Two strangers at the edge of survival, bound by a choice that would change everything. The pounding on his cabin door wasn't strong. It was the sound of knuckles too raw, too weary to make more than a hollow thud against weathered wood. But in the blackness of a mountain night, even that small sound carried the weight of desperation. Inside, Jonah Ward froze, his hand still on the axe he had been oiling by lamplight. He thought he had left the world behind, thought no one would dare come this far up the ridge. Yet the knock came again, weaker this time, followed by a broken voice. "Please, I'll sleep outside your door like a dog if you don't let me in." Jonah's jaw clenched. It was a woman's voice, hoarse, near gone, but steady enough to carry its pleading through the cold timber walls. He rose, the floorboards creaking beneath his heavy boots, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. The last time he'd opened his door to strangers, it had cost him blood. But then the words came again, softer, shaking now, and with them something else, another sound, faint and fragile, a child's whimper. Jonah's grip tightened on the axe handle, though he knew it wasn't needed. Slowly, he lifted the latch. The wind shoved the door open before he could even finish the motion, and in its wake she stumbled forward, collapsing against the threshold. Her hair was plastered to her face with sleet, her dress torn at the hem, her shawl nothing more than rags that clung to her trembling frame. And in her arms, wrapped in a thin scrap of quilt, was a child who couldn't have seen more than a year in this world. Her knees buckled, and Jonah caught her before she struck the ground. She was light, too light, the weight of hunger and fear hollowing her frame. The child stirred weakly, a thin cry breaking against the storm before it faded into silence again. "God help us," the woman whispered, her lips cracked, eyes brimming though no tears fell. She didn't look at Jonah. She only clutched the baby tighter, as if afraid even the mountain air might steal the child away. Jonah carried her inside before she could protest, kicking the door shut with his boot and shutting out the shriek of the wind. The warmth of the fire barely filled the cabin, but to her it must have felt like salvation. He laid her on the bearskin rug near the hearth, careful not to jostle the infant. She didn't release the child even as her body sagged with exhaustion, as if her very life depended on keeping him close. "Name," Jonah said flatly, crouching low. She blinked, dazed, before answering. "Martha, Martha Hale." Her voice cracked on the name, but she forced it through. She angled her chin toward the baby in her arms. "His name, Samuel." Jonah nodded once, sharp, and set about stirring the coals. He poured water into the blackened kettle and hung it over the flame. All the while he watched her, not with suspicion, but with the measured caution of a man who had seen too much of life to ever take it at face value. Her fingers stroked the baby's damp hair, though they shook so badly she could hardly manage it. The kettle hissed, steam rising. Jonah set down 2 tin cups, poured hot water, and slid one toward her. She gripped it with both hands, nearly spilling half as she raised it to her lips. The sound of her swallowing filled the quiet, and for a moment it was the only sound in the cabin save the fire's low crackle. Jonah leaned back on his heels. "Why here?" Martha lowered the cup, her lashes heavy with weariness. We had nowhere else. Walked till my legs near gave. Folks said there was a man up the ridge, alone. They said you wouldn't turn a woman and babe into the snow." Her words faltered, but her gaze did not. "Tell me they were right." Jonah's silence stretched. He had not invited her, yet she was here, fragile as a dying flame and stubborn as stone. He knew he could send her away, knew it would mean her death, and the child. He also knew that letting her stay would bind him to something he had sworn to avoid since the day the war and the grave had taken nearly everything from him. Martha's body trembled as she pulled the quilt higher around her son. "I'll sleep outside your door if I must," she whispered again, voice frayed but fierce. "But he won't last the night out there, please." Jonah closed his eyes briefly. He had thought he was finished with choices like this. But when he opened them again, he found himself moving without hesitation. He took a thick blanket from the bed and laid it over her, tucking it around the baby's tiny form. "You'll stay," he said simply. His voice carried no softness but no threat either, just a weight that brooked no argument. For the first time, Martha's face slackened, the lines of fear easing. She exhaled shakily, her arms still holding Samuel as if nothing could pry him free. Her head dropped back against the rug, and though she tried to fight it, sleep dragged her under. Jonah sat back in the lone chair near the hearth, his eyes fixed on mother and child. Outside, the storm raged, battering the shutters like a beast denied its prey. Inside, for the first time in years, his cabin was not empty. And deep down, Jonah Ward knew nothing would be the same again. The storm pressed on through the night, its howl rattling the cabin walls like a drum of judgment. But inside, the fire held steady, a stubborn glow that painted the rough-hewn timbers with shifting orange light. Jonah did not sleep. He sat rigid in his chair, hands braced on his knees, eyes unyielding on the woman and child huddled beneath the heavy quilt. Years alone had hardened him into a man who trusted silence more than company. Yet here, silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with the sound of their breathing, fragile threads, tethering 3 lives together in that single room. Martha stirred first. Her head jerked up as though some unseen hand had shaken her awake. For a moment she looked disoriented, as though unsure whether she still stood in the storm. Then her gaze fell on Samuel, still asleep in her arms, cheeks faintly pink now where before they had been gray. She sagged in relief, kissing the crown of his head before noticing Jonah watching her. She tensed, clutching the child closer. Jonah didn't move. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but not unkind. "He'll make it through the night," he said low, his voice gravel-worn from disuse. Martha nodded faintly, her throat tight with unshed words. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't just gratitude for the warmth or the shelter. It was thanks for Samuel's tiny chest still rising and falling against hers. But she said no more. Words were dangerous. They opened doors she couldn't close again. Jonah rose from his chair, broad frame shadowing the firelight. Water on the shelf, bread too, what's left of it. He moved to the door, pulling his coat from the peg. The iron latch clicked under his hand. Martha startled. "You're leaving." Fear colored her tone, as though he might vanish and leave her to the mountain's teeth. Jonah shook his head. "Animals." He opened the door just enough to slip through. The wind tore inside like a wild thing before he shut it again, leaving her alone with the fire's glow. The cabin felt larger without him, though the walls remained the same distance apart. Martha exhaled, resting her cheek against Samuel's soft hair. She traced the baby's tiny fingers, watching them curl instinctively around her thumb. Her heart ached with the weight of exhaustion and relief, tangled into a knot too tight to unravel. Jonah returned not long after, snow dusting his beard and shoulders. He shook it off by the hearth before removing his coat. Martha studied him carefully. He moved with efficiency, every gesture purposeful. This was a man who had built survival into habit, who knew the mountain's rhythm the way others knew city bells. Yet under the surface of that rigid frame, she sensed something else, a hollowness, as though whatever had once filled him had long since been stripped away. Samuel stirred, releasing a weak cry. Martha hushed him, swaying gently. Jonah watched, a flicker of something crossing his features before it was gone. He set a log onto the fire, sparks jumping in protest. "You came far," he said finally. His tone made it less a question, more an observation. Martha swallowed hard, her voice rasping. "From Harrow's Crossing, took the road west until there was no road. After that, just walking." Her eyes darkened with memory. "Couldn't stay. Not after," she broke off, clutching Samuel tighter. Jonah didn't press. He simply nodded, turning the kettle toward the flames. The silence stretched again, but this time Martha felt it was a silence she could rest in, not fear. By morning the storm had broken, leaving the world outside wrapped in fragile stillness. Snow hung heavy on the pines, and the trail down the ridge vanished beneath white drifts. Jonah stepped onto the porch, breath clouding in the crisp air. He scanned the horizon with the eyes of a man who trusted the land but never underestimated it. No movement, no tracks but his own. Still, something gnawed at him. The knock, her words, the desperation that had driven her up here. People didn't wander these mountains by accident, not with a child in their arms. Inside, Martha tried to stand, but her legs buckled under the weight of fatigue. Jonah caught her arm before she could fall. She flinched at his touch, then steadied herself. "You're not strong enough to walk yet," he said. Her jaw tightened, pride prickling, but she did not argue. Instead, she lowered herself back onto the stool near the hearth. Samuel balanced carefully on her lap. The baby's eyes fluttered open, pale blue, searching the world with the blind trust of innocence. Jonah studied the boy. He saw hunger there, but also life. A fragile spark, easily extinguished, but burning nonetheless. He found himself reaching for a jar of goat's milk from the shelf, pouring it into a small tin cup. He warmed it over the fire before setting it gently in Martha's hands. Her eyes lifted to his, startled. Why would you?" "Child won't last on cold air and prayers alone," Jonah said simply. Martha's lips trembled. She held the cup carefully, feeding Samuel drop by drop. When the baby latched, his tiny jaw working, tears slipped down her face unbidden. She bent over him, pressing her lips to his brow, whispering thanks she couldn't voice aloud. Jonah turned away, giving her privacy, but the sound of that quiet gratitude lodged in his chest. It had been years since he'd heard anything like it. Too many nights had passed in silence, his only company the groan of the timbers and the howl of the wind. The day passed in fragments. Jonah chopped wood, his axe rising and falling in a rhythm as steady as his breath. Martha mended her shawl with clumsy stitches, pausing often to soothe Samuel. Each time the baby cried, Jonah found his hands tightening on the axe handle as though the sound cut too deep. But when laughter followed, a soft gurgle, a bubbling giggle, it disarmed him more than any rifle ever could. By nightfall, the snow reflected silver under a swollen moon. Jonah stood guard at the window, lantern dimmed. His instincts prickled. The storm had covered many sins, but it could not bury all tracks. He had lived too long on the edge of danger not to know when it drew near. Martha noticed his vigilance. "You expect someone?" she asked quietly. Jonah didn't answer right away. His gaze swept the tree line before he finally muttered, "No one comes up this ridge without reason. Not in winter. Not unless they're driven by something or chasing it." Her breath caught, her mind racing with all the shadows she thought she'd left behind. She tightened her arms around Samuel, heart pounding. Jonah glanced at her then, his eyes narrowing slightly. He saw the fear she tried to bury. He didn't ask, but he knew. Whatever storm had driven her here wasn't finished. As the fire burned low, Martha's eyelids grew heavy. She fought sleep, but exhaustion won. Jonah stayed at the window, silent and watchful, the axe resting by his chair. Outside, the mountain lay still. But in that stillness, Jonah heard it, the faintest echo of hoofbeats, distant yet undeniable. He straightened slowly, jaw hardening, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the pines. Trouble was coming, and now he wasn't alone to face it. The hoofbeats were faint, far off enough to be mistaken for echoes of the storm's retreating breath. But Jonah Ward knew better. His years in these mountains had trained his ear sharper than any hound, and he could tell the difference between wind dragging a branch across snow and the deliberate rhythm of horses pressing through drifts. The sound came steady, not rushed, not panicked. Whoever they were moving with the calm confidence of men who believed the land belonged to them. That chilled Jonah more than the snow outside. He moved from the window without a sound, pulling the lamp wick low until the room dimmed to little more than embers glowing in the hearth. Martha stirred, half waking, Samuel tucked in her arms. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice raw with sleep and the edge of fear. Jonah didn't answer. His hand lifted, palm flat, a silent command to stay quiet. Martha's lips pressed shut as she clutched Samuel tighter, her heartbeat pounding loud in her ears. She watched Jonah stride to the corner of the cabin where a rifle leaned against the wall. He checked the chamber with practiced ease, the soft click of metal against metal barely audible over the crackle of the fire. The hoofbeats grew clearer, moving closer, then stopped. The mountain fell silent, holding its breath. Jonah waited, every muscle coiled tight, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. For a moment there was nothing, and Martha dared to think perhaps she had only dreamed the sound. But then came a new noise, faint at first, then undeniable. A man's voice, low and muffled, carrying just enough through the trees. Jonah's jaw clenched. He didn't recognize the words, but the tone was clear, men speaking to each other with the easy cadence of those unafraid. Jonah turned from the window and motioned toward Martha. He pointed at the bed, a silent order for her to hide. She shook her head, fear tightening her throat, but he gave her a look sharp enough to brook no refusal. She slipped onto the bed, pulling the quilt high to cover herself and Samuel, her breath shallow beneath the heavy wool. Jonah stood in the center of the cabin, rifle in hand, waiting. The knock, when it came, was not like Martha's desperate pounding. It was bold, the kind of knock that demanded rather than begged. 3 sharp raps against the wood, echoing through the small room. "Evening in there," a voice called, smooth, confident. "We saw smoke on the ridge. Cold night to be keeping warm all alone." Jonah said nothing. He stared at the door, silent as stone. Another knock, harder this time. "Won't ask twice, friend, open up. Ain't neighborly to ignore travelers, now is it?" Martha's breath caught under the quilt. She pressed Samuel closer to her chest, praying the child would not stir, would not cry. Jonah's eyes flicked to the fire. He reached down and dragged a heavy iron pot across the coals, smothering the flame until only faint embers glowed. Darkness swallowed the cabin whole, leaving only slivers of moonlight slipping through the shutters. The knock came again, louder, followed by the scrape of boots outside on the porch. Jonah leveled the rifle, his breathing slow, steady. He didn't aim to fire, not yet, but his finger brushed the trigger guard with quiet intent. "Might be no one home," another voice muttered outside, this one rougher, impatient. "No," the first replied. "There's someone, fire was burning, saw it plain." Jonah moved silently to the door, pressing his shoulder against the frame. He listened. 2 men, maybe 3, horses restless in the snow. They hadn't come all this way by chance, and if they'd seen the smoke, they'd know someone was inside. The latch jiggled. Jonah's hand shot out, gripping the handle tight from the inside, holding it firm. The man outside chuckled darkly. "Stubborn one, eh? That's fine, we'll wait. Storm or no storm, we've got time." Their footsteps retreated a little, the sound of horses shifting, men speaking low among themselves. Jonah stayed rooted to the door, every nerve stretched tight. Minutes passed, long and cruel, until the cabin was quiet again. Still, he didn't move. Behind him, Martha whispered, barely audible, "Who are they?" Jonah didn't look back. "Not friends." She shivered under the quilt. Samuel stirred, his tiny cry muffled quickly by her hand against his lips. Jonah's gaze flicked toward them, his eyes dark in the moonlight. He crossed the room, crouched low, and spoke in a whisper rough as gravel. "They know we're here, best thing is quiet. They'll circle, wait for weakness. We give 'em none." Martha nodded, clutching Samuel close. "They're looking for me," she confessed in a trembling whisper. "I know it. They must have followed." Jonah studied her face, seeing the truth she could no longer hide. His jaw hardened, but he didn't ask more, not yet. "Then you best pray this cabin holds," he muttered. The rest of the night dragged on, heavy with silence broken only by the distant snort of horses and the creak of leather saddles. Jonah never left his post by the door. Martha never loosened her hold on Samuel, even as sleep pulled at her aching body. Dawn crept slow, gray light seeping through the shutters, but the danger didn't fade with the storm. When Jonah finally cracked the door, the snow outside was trampled with fresh prints. Hooves, boots. They hadn't left. They were waiting, somewhere in the trees, biding their time. Jonah shut the door softly and turned back to Martha. "They'll come again," he said. "Question is, for what?" Martha's lips parted, but her voice faltered. She glanced down at Samuel, his small fist curled against her chest. Fear tightened her features until Jonah stepped closer, his voice steady though his eyes burned with warning. "You brought more than hunger to my door, Martha Hale. Whatever storm follows you, it's here now. And if we're to survive it, I need the truth." Martha's eyes filled, her voice breaking. "They'll never let us be. Not me, not Samuel. He isn't." She stopped, swallowing hard, but Jonah could see the weight pressing on her chest. A secret too heavy to keep. A truth that had hunted her across miles of wilderness and driven her to his door. And before she could finish, the sound came again. Hoofbeats, this time closer, deliberate. The riders had returned. The hoofbeats didn't pass this time. They stopped, right outside. Snow crunched under boots, and the low murmur of men's voices carried through the still morning air. Jonah Ward stood rigid by the window, rifle in hand, every nerve taut. Martha sat frozen on the bed, Samuel pressed against her chest, his soft breath muffled beneath the folds of her shawl. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with a terror she had been too long hiding, and Jonah saw in her face that whatever secret she carried had finally arrived to claim her. The first knock on the door was not a knock at all. It was a fist slamming hard enough to rattle the frame. "Open up," the voice barked, sharper than last night. "Ain't no use pretending you're not in there. Cabin's warm, smoke still coming from the chimney. We ain't leaving till you answer." Jonah didn't move. He didn't so much as blink. His finger rested lightly against the rifle's trigger guard, but he hadn't yet made the choice to fire. Instead, he stood in silence, forcing them to show their hand. A second voice spoke, rough, mocking. "Reckon he's got her in there. Tracks lead straight up this ridge. You saw 'em same as I did." Martha's breath caught, her knuckles white against the quilt. She clutched Samuel tighter, rocking him instinctively, praying he wouldn't cry. Jonah's gaze flicked toward her, sharp, commanding her stillness without words. The first man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Come now, Martha. You've made this hard enough. Don't think hiding behind some mountain drifter will save you. Bring the child out, and maybe we'll let you live long enough to wish you hadn't run." Her name, spoken so casually, Jonah's eyes narrowed. He had guessed before, but now he knew for certain. The men weren't searching blindly. They had hunted her here, through storm and wilderness, and they weren't leaving without blood. Jonah stepped closer to the door, his voice low and steady. "You've got no business here." For a heartbeat, silence. Then the men laughed, cruel and certain. "You hear that? Fella thinks this mountain makes him king." A heavy boot struck the door again, hard enough to splinter wood. "Step aside, stranger. Ain't your fight. Hand the woman over. Hand the babe." Behind him, Martha whimpered. "Please," she whispered. Jonah didn't know if the plea was to him or to God. The axe leaned near the hearth. The rifle was in Jonah's hands. He weighed both choices in his mind, but he knew brute force wouldn't win against 3 armed riders. He needed more than weapons. He needed resolve. He turned his head slightly, meeting Martha's eyes. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why do they want the child?" Her face crumpled, years of grief and fear rushing to the surface. Her lips trembled, but when she spoke, her words came in a rush. "Because Samuel isn't mine, not by blood. His father is a man with power, too much. He cast me out when I wouldn't give the boy up. Said the child wasn't fit to carry his name, that he'd see him dead before he let me raise him. So I ran. They've been chasing us since." The truth struck like lightning. Jonah looked at Samuel, small, fragile, barely clinging to life, and felt the weight of what she'd said settle heavy in his chest. This wasn't just a woman and child lost in the snow. This was defiance against cruelty, a mother by choice, a boy hunted for no sin of his own. Jonah's jaw tightened. He had thought himself finished with battles that weren't his. But the sight of Martha, trembling and broken, yet still holding Samuel as though her very soul depended on it, tore down whatever walls he had left. Another slam rattled the door. "Last chance, mountain man." Jonah's eyes hardened. He turned back to Martha. "Stay low, don't move till I say." Before she could answer, the door shuddered under a heavy shoulder. Wood cracked, the latch straining. Jonah braced himself. He knew once that door gave way, there'd be no turning back. The first blow broke the hinges. The second sent the door crashing inward, snow swirling into the cabin with the men's boots. 3 of them, broad-shouldered, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats and scarves. The first carried a pistol already drawn. The second gripped a length of chain coiled in his hand. The third had a rifle slung lazily across his back, though his eyes glittered with cruel anticipation. "Step aside," the leader growled. "Ain't your concern." Jonah raised his rifle, the barrel steady. "It is now." For a moment time seemed to freeze. The fire popped in the hearth. Samuel whimpered softly, the sound slicing through the silence. The men's eyes shifted toward the bed. "Reckon we found our prize," the second sneered. They stepped forward. Jonah fired. The blast thundered through the cabin, smoke filling the air. The leader staggered back, clutching his arm, his pistol clattering to the floor. Chaos erupted. The second man lunged with the chain, swinging it wide. Jonah sidestepped, bringing the rifle's stock crashing into the attacker's jaw. Bone cracked. The man fell hard against the table, splintering wood as he crumpled. The third yanked his rifle from his back, but Martha screamed, a raw, desperate sound that startled him just long enough for Jonah to close the distance. The mountain man seized the barrel, wrenching it aside as it discharged harmlessly into the ceiling. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Blood dripped onto the snow just beyond the threshold, the leader's curses echoing through the trees. The other 2 groaned on the floor, stunned but not dead. Jonah stood in the wreckage of his once quiet cabin, chest heaving, rifle gripped tight in his hands. Martha sobbed softly, clutching Samuel to her breast, rocking him as if the motion alone could shield him from what had just happened. Jonah glanced at her, then back at the fallen men. He knew this wasn't over. Men like these didn't travel alone, and if the child's father truly had power, this was only the beginning. The leader staggered up, clutching his bloodied arm. His eyes burned with rage as he spat into the snow. "You don't know what you've done, mountain man. This ain't a fight you can win. More will come, and when they do, you'll wish you'd let her freeze." Jonah leveled the rifle again, forcing the man back through the doorway. The others stumbled after him, dragging themselves into the snow. They mounted their horses, wounded but not broken. "Next time," the leader hissed, "we don't knock." They spurred their mounts and vanished into the trees, leaving only churned snow and the echo of their threat. Jonah slammed the door shut, bracing it with the heavy table. His breath came hard, his pulse still racing. He turned back to Martha, who sat trembling on the bed, Samuel quiet in her arms now, though his tiny fist still clutched her shawl. Her eyes met Jonah's, full of fear and something else, hope mingled with dread. Jonah exhaled, the weight of choice pressing heavy. His cabin was no longer just his. Trouble had been dragged across his threshold, and by opening his door he had bound himself to it. He knew the men would return, and when they did, they wouldn't come with threats, they'd come with fire. The cabin reeked of gunpowder and smoke. The fire still burned low in the hearth, but its light did little to cut through the heaviness that lingered in the air. The door sagged against the splintered frame, the wood cracked and bruised from the force of the men's blows. Jonah Ward stood with his hands braced against the table he'd shoved in front of it, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the flickering shadows that stretched across the floor. For years he had lived in silence, convinced the mountain's remoteness was enough to keep the world and all its cruelties at bay. But tonight, the storm hadn't brought solitude, it had carried trouble right to his doorstep. Behind him, Martha rocked Samuel slowly, the child pressed against her breast. Her body shook with quiet sobs, but her tears were silent now, worn thin by the years of running, by the weight of fear that had stalked her every mile. She kept her gaze lowered, not daring to look at Jonah until his voice, low and rough, broke the quiet. "They'll be back." She flinched, clutching Samuel tighter. "I know," she whispered. Her throat was dry, her voice trembling, but there was no denying the truth in it. "They never stop." Jonah turned to face her. His eyes were sharp but not unkind. He studied the way she held Samuel, as if her very soul was wrapped up in that tiny body. He thought of what she had said, that Samuel wasn't hers by blood, but still hers by something deeper, something no man could strip away. Jonah's jaw tightened. "They won't let him live," Jonah said. It wasn't a question. He knew men like the ones who had just ridden off into the snow. Men with power didn't chase across wilderness just for spite. They hunted to the end because they believed the world bent to their will. Martha raised her eyes then, and in them burned a fierce, desperate fire. "Not while I draw breath," she said hoarsely. Her arms trembled around Samuel, but her grip never loosened. Jonah looked away, pacing once across the narrow cabin before dragging the broken chair back upright and sitting heavily. He ran a hand over his beard, the crackle of fire and Martha's soft rocking the only sounds for a long time. Finally, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Tell me everything." Martha swallowed hard. She stared down at Samuel's sleeping face, her lips trembling as she struggled to form the words. His father's name is Ambrose Garrison, owns near half the county, or so he claims. Cattle, land, men who do his bidding without question. I was in his house once." Her voice broke and she pressed her face against Samuel's soft hair. "I thought he meant to make me his wife. Thought maybe he was better than the others. I was wrong." Jonah didn't interrupt. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees, listening with the stillness of a man who had learned long ago how much could be revealed in silence. Martha's hands shook as she went on. "When Samuel was born, Ambrose looked at him and saw nothing but weakness, said the boy was cursed, said he'd never carry his blood, never inherit a thing. He ordered me to leave him in the river." Her voice cracked into a sob, her body curling protectively around Samuel. "I couldn't. I ran. And Ambrose sent his men after us. They've been hunting us since." Jonah's fists clenched. He knew cruelty, had seen it on battlefields, in towns torn apart by greed. But there was something about the thought of a man hunting his own blood, a helpless child, that burned hotter than any rage he had known in years. He forced his voice calm, but his words cut sharp. "Then Ambrose won't stop until Samuel's dead." Martha's chin lifted, her eyes wet but unyielding. "Then we won't stop running." Jonah held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the wear in her face, the gauntness of hunger, the hollowing of endless nights spent in fear. She was at the end of her strength, but still she clung to the boy as though her very life had meaning only through his. Something inside Jonah shifted. He had lived alone for years, walling himself off from the world. But now, looking at her, at Samuel, he felt the mountain inside him crack. "You won't outrun him," Jonah said firmly. "Not alone, not with a child." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "But you're not alone anymore." Martha blinked, her lips parting in disbelief. You'd help us." Jonah's eyes flicked toward the broken door, then back to her. "I already did." His voice was flat, but there was no denying the truth of it. He had chosen the moment he opened his door, the moment he lifted his rifle. Now there was no going back. For a long time Martha said nothing. She stared at him, tears sliding down her cheeks silently, her arms rocking Samuel in that slow rhythm. Finally she whispered, "God bless you." Jonah shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the weight of gratitude. He wasn't a man who sought blessings. He was a man who survived. But something in Martha's words touched a part of him long buried. The rest of the day passed with grim purpose. Jonah set to work reinforcing the cabin, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he dragged timbers from the shed and braced them against the splintered door. He checked the shutters, tightened the hinges, laid tools and weapons where he could reach them in the dark. Martha did what she could, mending, gathering, keeping Samuel close. Though she moved with exhaustion, She carried herself with quiet determination, the strength of a woman who had been broken but refused to yield. By nightfall the snow had ceased, leaving the ridge eerily silent under the pale glow of the moon. Jonah lit no lamp, keeping the cabin cloaked in shadow. He sat by the window, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. Martha lay near the fire, Samuel curled against her. Sleep claimed her at last, but it was a restless, fragile thing. Jonah listened to every creak, every sigh of the wind, his mind turning over the same truth again and again. This mountain would not be enough to keep Garrison's men away. The night stretched long. Jonah's thoughts wandered places he had long forbidden. He thought of the life he once had, of the family buried years ago beneath foreign soil, of the silence he had built around himself like armor. He thought of the woman and child sleeping now in his cabin, and how fragile that armor suddenly felt. He thought of what would come when Ambrose sent more men, better armed, less reckless. The first light of dawn bled slowly across the horizon. Jonah rose stiffly, setting the rifle aside. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his lungs. The ridge lay quiet, snow unbroken except for the churned patches left by last night's riders. But quiet was no comfort. Quiet was a waiting beast. When he returned inside, Martha was awake, cradling Samuel, her eyes hollow but alert. She looked at him with a question she didn't dare voice. He answered it anyway. "They'll come back, maybe not today, but soon." Her lips trembled, but she nodded, stroking Samuel's soft hair. "Then we'll be ready." Jonah met her gaze. For the first time in years, he wasn't preparing only for himself. He was preparing for something more, something worth fighting for. And deep in his chest, he felt it stir, the old fire, the one he thought long dead. The days that followed were heavy with tension. The mountain air was still, but it was the stillness of a bowstring drawn taut, waiting for the arrow to fly. Jonah Ward felt it in his bones, in the way the ridge seemed too quiet, too watchful. Every breath of wind through the pines made him reach for his rifle. Every creak of the timbers set his jaw tighter. He had lived alone so long that silence had been his comfort. Now, with Martha and Samuel under his roof, silence was no longer safety. It was a warning. He rose before dawn each day, tending to the animals, chopping wood, and checking the traps he'd set along the trail that wound up the ridge. He left no sign of his own passing, erasing his tracks with care, but he studied the snow for marks that didn't belong. Each morning he found none, and yet his unease deepened. Men like Ambrose Garrison's riders didn't give up. They were gathering, waiting. Inside the cabin, Martha did her best to bring life to the dark corners. She mended what she could with her fraying needle, humming softly to Samuel when he fussed, whispering prayers under her breath when she thought Jonah wasn't listening. Samuel grew stronger in those days. His cheeks, once pale and hollow, filled with the flush of warmth. His cries grew louder, his fists more insistent. For every smile that crossed Martha's lips, Jonah found his resolve hardening. This child was no mistake, no curse. He was life itself, and no man had the right to snuff it out. But each time Samuel laughed, Jonah's chest tightened. It had been years since laughter, small and unguarded, had filled his home. It reminded him of what he had lost, and of what could so easily be taken again. He kept his distance, busying his hands with tasks that didn't need doing, because looking too long at Martha holding that boy threatened to undo the careful armor he had built. On the third night, Jonah didn't sleep. He sat by the window staring into the trees when he caught it, the faint glow of a lantern moving between the trunks. Slow, deliberate, not a traveler lost, a man searching. Jonah's grip tightened on the rifle. He didn't fire. He didn't move. He only watched as the lantern bobbed, then faded back into the forest. He knew then that the waiting was almost over. At dawn, he broke the news to Martha. "They're here," he said simply. Her face went white. "How many?" "Don't know yet." He strapped his rifle across his back, his knife at his hip. "But they'll come when they're ready, not before." Martha clutched Samuel to her chest, pressing a kiss to his forehead as though to shield him with the gesture alone. "We can't run." Jonah shook his head. Snow's too deep, trails cut off. They'd catch us before we made it 2 miles. His gaze hardened. This ridge is the only chance we have. She swallowed, nodding slowly. She didn't argue, she knew he was right. The day passed with a restless rhythm. Jonah fortified the cabin further, driving nails into planks, setting snares along the outer path, and stacking firewood close against the wall to serve as barricade. Martha boiled what little beans they had left, though her hands trembled the whole time. She kept glancing toward the door as if expecting it to splinter inward again. Samuel cried at the noise of hammering, and Martha sang softly, her voice cracking but steady, until he calmed. By nightfall, the ridge was too quiet again. Jonah sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. Martha sat opposite him, Samuel asleep in her arms. The lamplight threw their shadows long across the walls, and for the first time since she had arrived, Martha spoke without hesitation. "Why are you helping us?" she asked softly. Jonah's eyes lifted, steady and unreadable. "Door was knocked, could have left you there, didn't." "That's not an answer," she pressed, her voice low but insistent. He leaned back, silence stretching long. Finally, he muttered, "Because I know what it is to lose, and I won't stand by and watch it happen again." Martha's eyes glistened. She didn't ask what he had lost. She didn't need to. The weight in his voice told her enough. She bowed her head over Samuel, whispering, "Then God sent us to the right door." Jonah shifted, uncomfortable with the rawness of her words, but he didn't argue. Deep inside, though, something stirred, a memory of kneeling in the dark, praying for someone to survive, and the silence that had answered him. Now, perhaps, he was the answer someone else had prayed for. The next morning broke cold and brittle. The sky was washed pale, the air biting. Jonah stepped outside to fetch water from the stream when he saw them. 3 riders at the tree line. Not close, not yet, but close enough that their silhouettes were sharp against the snow. One lifted a spyglass to his eye, studying the cabin. Jonah stood tall, meeting the gaze even at a distance, and after a moment the rider lowered the glass. They didn't advance. They simply turned their horses and vanished back into the woods. Jonah returned to the cabin, his face grim. "They're scouting, testing the ground. Next time it won't be just 3. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "How many will come?" "As many as he can spare," Jonah answered. He leaned his rifle against the wall and poured water into the kettle. His tone was steady, almost too steady, but Martha could hear the weight beneath it. That night's sleep was impossible. Martha dozed only in fits, jerking awake at every creak, every gust of wind. Jonah stayed near the window, silent and unmovable, the rifle a part of him. Hours dragged until finally, deep in the night, Samuel began to cry, loud, piercing, insistent. Martha hushed him, rocking, but the sound filled the small cabin. Jonah froze. His eyes snapped to the window. Out there in the trees, lanterns flickered, dozens moving closer. He rose slowly, his voice a whisper edged with steel. "They're here." Martha's blood turned to ice. She pressed Samuel against her, rocking him though her own body shook. Jonah moved to the door, bracing it with his shoulder, his eyes burning in the dim light. The hoofbeats came next, slow and deliberate, the sound of power pressing in on them. Then a voice, loud and commanding, carried through the night. "Martha Hale, you know who sends me. Bring the child out and no harm will come to you. Resist, and this cabin will burn with you inside." Martha's breath broke. She turned to Jonah, her face pale, eyes desperate. "He'll kill us. He'll kill him." Jonah tightened his grip on the rifle. His voice was low, fierce, unyielding. "Then he'll have to kill me first." The voice outside lingered in the air like smoke, curling through the cracks of the cabin until it filled every corner. Martha Hale clutched Samuel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her body trembling as if the words themselves had struck her. Jonah Ward stood at the door, the wood straining beneath his shoulder as the sound of hoofbeats multiplied. More riders, more weight pressing down on the ridge. The man outside spoke again, his tone calm, too calm for the threat he carried. We don't need to waste blood. Hand the child over, Martha. Ambrose has no quarrel with you, but if you force our hand, we'll take the boy over your body." Samuel whimpered in his mother's arms as though he understood the danger. Martha pressed her lips to his brow, whispering broken prayers against his skin. Jonah listened, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "You hear me, mountain man," the voice called. "Don't make her die for your stubbornness. She'll thank you if you step aside." Jonah's voice, when it came, was low and steady, iron wrapped in gravel. "You take one step closer, and the snow's gonna drink your blood before dawn." The men outside laughed. Cruel laughter, the kind that made Martha's skin crawl. She pulled Samuel closer, rocking him as though her arms could keep the world itself at bay. Jonah looked back at her, meeting her eyes in the dim light. "They'll test us first," he murmured. "See if we'll break easy. We won't." Martha's lips parted, trembling. "You can't fight them all." "I don't have to," Jonah said, moving toward the window. He slid the shutter open just a crack, enough to glimpse the shapes gathering at the tree line. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, the steam of horses rising like ghostly fog. A dozen men at least, maybe more. Jonah's pulse steadied. Fear had no place here, only resolve. He turned back to Martha, his voice sharp but not unkind. "You'll stay low, keep him quiet as you can. When they come, you don't move until I say." Martha nodded, tears burning her eyes. She wanted to argue, to plead with him to run, but deep inside she knew there was no running. The snow was too deep, the riders too many. The only way through was to stand. The first shot cracked through the night, shattering the quiet like glass. A bullet slammed into the wall just above the window, spraying splinters across the cabin. Martha gasped, ducking down over Samuel. Jonah didn't flinch. He raised his rifle, took aim through the narrow slit, and fired. The crack of his shot echoed like thunder. Outside, a horse screamed and a rider tumbled into the snow. Shouts followed. Chaos erupted in the tree line. More shots rang out, slamming into the cabin walls, thudding against the timbers Jonah had braced. The cabin shook with every impact, but it held. Jonah reloaded quickly, movements sharp and practiced. He fired again, and another rider fell. Inside, the air grew thick with smoke and fear. Martha clutched Samuel under the bed, her lips moving in prayer. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the men outside must hear it. Samuel whimpered, but she rocked him, humming a broken lullaby, her voice cracking as she begged heaven to spare them. Jonah fought like a man carved from the mountain itself. Every time a shot came close, he shifted, steady as stone, answering fire with fire. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with something Martha had never seen before. Not anger, not even hatred, but a fierce, unshakable determination. He had chosen his ground, and he would not yield it. The riders pressed closer, their boots crunching against the snow. The door shook under the weight of their pounding. Jonah braced it with his shoulder, firing again through the gap in the shutters. One man screamed, falling hard into the drift, but still they came. "Burn it," one of them shouted. "Light it up." Martha's blood ran cold. She smelled the faint, acrid sting of oil, heard the slosh of liquid being thrown against the cabin walls. Jonah cursed under his breath, snapping the shutter shut. "They mean to smoke us out." "No," Martha gasped, shaking her head fiercely. "No, please, Samuel, Jonah crossed the room in 2 strides, gripping her shoulders. His voice was rough but steady. "Look at me. They burn us out, we don't wait inside. You hear? We fight outside or we die choking." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She knew he spoke the truth. The first torch arced through the night, flames trailing behind it like a comet. It struck the cabin wall, sparks scattering across the snow. Jonah seized it through the crack in the shutters and hurled it back, his bare hand seared but his aim true. The torch landed in the drift, smothered instantly. A second torch followed. Jonah shot the man before it left his hand. Another rider screamed, clutching his side as he toppled from the saddle. The night stretched on in chaos. Bullets, fire, the howl of men and horses. Jonah moved with relentless precision, every shot buying another breath, another heartbeat for the woman and child behind him. Martha prayed, her voice shaking but unbroken, as Samuel whimpered in her arms. At last silence fell. The riders' shouts faded, their hoofbeats retreating into the darkness. Jonah lowered his rifle slowly, his breath ragged. He stood at the window, watching the tree line, but no more figures emerged. Only the trampled snow remained, marked with blood and broken torches. He turned back to Martha. She sat trembling, Samuel asleep against her chest, her face streaked with tears. Their eyes met, and for a long moment nothing passed between them but the raw truth of survival. "They'll come again," Jonah said finally, his voice low. Martha swallowed hard, nodding. "Then we'll be ready." But even as she spoke the words, her hands tightened around Samuel. She knew what Jonah hadn't yet said aloud. This was no longer a siege. It was a war, and Ambrose garrison would not rest until the child was his or dead. Jonah set the rifle aside, his broad shoulders slumping with exhaustion, but his eyes burned steady in the dim light. He had opened his door once, and the world had rushed in. Now he understood. There was no closing it again. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The dawn that broke over the ridge was thin and gray, the kind of light that held no warmth, only the promise of another day survived. Smoke clung to the timbers of Jonah Ward's cabin, charred scars marking where torches had struck and been beaten back. The snow outside was churned into a battlefield, blood spattered against drifts, horseshoe prints gouged deep, and the still form of one rider half buried where the cold had claimed him before his comrades could drag him away. Inside, the air was heavy with exhaustion. Martha Hale sat against the wall, Samuel nestled against her chest. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but her arms had never loosened around the boy. Through every shot, every crash, every scream, she had clung to him as if the act itself could command God to keep him breathing. Now he slept, warm beneath her shawl, his tiny fingers twitching with dreams, innocent of the violence that had surrounded him. Jonah moved like a shadow across the room, his steps slow but certain. His body ached from the night's fight, shoulder bruised, hand burned raw from the torch, but he didn't falter. He poured water into a tin, washing the blood from his palm, the sting grounding him in the present. He had survived worse. He would survive this. But for the first time in years, his survival was no longer his alone. "They'll come again," Martha whispered, her voice thin but steady. She wasn't asking, she knew. Jonah looked at her, eyes dark beneath his furrowed brow. "They will, and not just a handful either. Garrison's pride won't stomach a failure. He'll send more, enough to flatten this ridge if he has to." Her breath shuddered, though her grip on Samuel never loosened. "Then what do we do?" Jonah dried his hand on a rag, setting it aside. He leaned against the table, staring at the broken door he'd barricaded through the night. His silence stretched long, but Martha waited. She had seen in him a man who didn't waste words, who spoke only when his mind had settled on truth. Finally, he said, "We don't wait for them to come. We take the fight to them." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with fear. "No, you can't." "I can," Jonah cut in, his tone low but firm. "And I will. If we stay here, they'll burn this cabin with us inside. You and the boy deserve better than to die cornered." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "And what if you don't come back?" Jonah held her gaze unflinching. "Then you'll still have a chance. I'll leave you a path, a way out. But if I do come back," his voice softened just slightly, "then maybe this ends before it begins." Martha's lip trembled. She wanted to argue, to beg him not to risk himself, but she saw something in his eyes that stilled her tongue. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't driven by pride. He was simply a man who had made his choice, and that choice was them. The day passed in tense preparation. Jonah repaired what he could of the cabin, set more traps along the ridge, and gathered what little ammunition he had left. Martha helped where she could, though her hands shook, though every sound outside made her flinch. She boiled water, patched cloth, whispered prayers into Samuel's hair until her voice was hoarse. By evening, Jonah was ready. He strapped his knife at his hip, slung the rifle across his back, and stood at the threshold. Martha rose, clutching Samuel, her breath ragged. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "don't leave us." Jonah looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years he let himself feel the weight of another's plea. He stepped closer, his rough hand brushing Samuel's tiny head before resting on Martha's trembling shoulder. His voice was low, gravelly, but sure. "I'm not leaving, I'm fighting for you." Her tears spilled, her knees weakening, but she held his gaze. "Then may God keep you." Jonah nodded once, then stepped into the night. The forest swallowed him, the snow crunching under his boots as he descended the ridge. He moved like a predator, silent, steady, every sense sharpened. The lanterns of Garrison's camp glowed faintly through the trees below, the murmur of men's voices carrying in the stillness. Jonah crouched low, studying their numbers. 24 at least. Armed, restless, waiting for dawn to ride. Jonah's jaw tightened. He had seen worse odds. He had survived worse wars. He would not stop now. The first guard never saw him coming. Jonah's knife struck quick, silent, the body falling soft into the snow. He dragged it back into the shadows, covering the crimson stain with frost. Then he moved to the second and the third, each breath a measured prayer of focus. His hands moved with grim precision, the skills of a soldier resurrected after years buried beneath solitude. But no man could fight an army alone forever. A shout rang out sharp, cutting through the night. "He's here." The camp erupted. Lanterns flared, rifles raised, voices shouting. Jonah fired, each shot deliberate, each man dropped before the next could take aim. Chaos spread, horses screaming, men scattering into the trees. Jonah moved like smoke, striking, vanishing, striking again. For every rider who fell, 2 more surged forward. At the edge of the camp, a figure emerged. Tall, broad, draped in a heavy coat trimmed with fur. His beard was black streaked with gray, his eyes cold as winter steel. Ambrose Garrison. His voice cut through the chaos, commanding, furious. "Bring me the boy. Kill the mountain rat if you must, but bring me my son." Jonah's blood ran hotter than fire. He raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at the man who had sent all this death after a child he called his own. But before he could fire, a rider slammed into him, the rifle torn from his grip. Jonah fell hard into the snow, grappling, fists pounding, knife flashing. He drove the blade home, rolling free as the man collapsed. He snatched the rifle back, breath ragged, eyes scanning for Garrison. But the man was gone, retreated into the storm of his men, his voice still echoing. "The boy will be mine." Jonah fought until his body screamed, until the snow was littered with the fallen. Then, battered and bloodied, he withdrew into the trees, back toward the ridge. He knew he couldn't end it tonight, but he had broken them, shattered their certainty. Ambrose's men would think twice before charging blindly again. When Jonah stumbled back into the cabin at dawn, Martha was waiting. She rushed to him, Samuel in her arms, tears spilling as she saw the blood streaking his coat. "You came back," she whispered, voice breaking. Jonah sank into the chair by the fire, his chest heaving, his eyes weary but burning still. "Told you I would." Martha knelt before him, pressing Samuel into his arms. The child stirred, soft and warm against Jonah's chest, his tiny fist clutching at the rough fabric of his shirt. Jonah looked down at him, and for the first time in years, something unmovable inside him broke. He held the boy close, his heart pounding with a fierce, unshakable vow. "You're mine now," Jonah whispered, his voice raw. "Both of you. No man will take you while I've breath left." Martha's tears spilled freely as she pressed her hand over Jonah's. In that cabin, amid the scars of fire and battle, a family was forged, not of blood, but of choice, of defiance, of love stronger than fear. Outside, the mountain waited. Ambrose Garrison would come again with more men, with more fire. But for now, the storm had passed, and in its quiet aftermath, Jonah, Martha, and Samuel breathed as one. For the first time in years, Jonah Ward's cabin was no longer just a refuge. It was a home. The ridge lay silent, blanketed in fresh snow, covering the scars of battle as if the mountain itself wished to forget. But inside Jonah Ward's cabin, nothing was forgotten. Martha hummed softly as Samuel slept, her voice steady now, no longer cracked with fear. Jonah stood at the window, rifle resting nearby, his eyes scanning the tree line, not with the emptiness of solitude, but with the watchfulness of a man who had something worth protecting. When his gaze drifted back to Martha and the child, a rare softness touched his features. He had lived too long with only silence for company. Now the silence carried breath, laughter, prayer, family. They all knew the fight was not finished. Ambrose Garrison's shadow still loomed far beyond the ridge. But for this moment, for this fragile dawn, they were safe. And safety, Jonah thought as Samuel stirred and Martha's tired smile met his, was enough to begin again. Spring would come to the ridge in time, melting the snow, filling the streams, bringing new life where winter had tried to take all. Jonah knew the mountain's rhythm well. Storms always returned, but so did the thaw. As he sat by the fire with Samuel curled against his chest and Martha resting close beside him, he understood the truth he had fought so long to deny. He wasn't meant to face the world alone. Whatever came, be it Ambrose's wrath, fire, or storm, they would face it together. And in that quiet, Jonah Ward finally allowed himself something he had not dared in years.